The Ghost Stories of H.R. Wakefield. Blind Man's Buff by H.R. Wakefield. "Well, thank heavens that yokel seemed to know the place," said Mr. Cort to himself. "First to the right, second to the left, black gates. I hope the oafin Wendover who sent me 6 miles out of my way will freeze to death. It's not often like this in England, cold as the penny in a dead man's eye." He'd barely reached the place before dusk. He let the car out over the rasping, frozen roads. First to the right. Must be this. Second to the left. Must be this. And there were the black gates. He got out, swung them open, and drove cautiously up a narrow, twisting drive, his headlights peering suspiciously round the bends. Those hedges wanted clipping, he thought, and this lane would have to be remetalled, full of holes. Nasty drive up on a bad night. Would cost some money, though. The car began to climb steeply and swing to the right, and presently the high hedges ended abruptly, and Mr. Cort pulled up in front of Lawn Manor. He got out of the car, rubbed his hands, stamped his feet, and looked about him. Lawn Manor was embedded halfway up a Chiltern spur, and, as the agent had observed, commanded extensive vistas. The place looked its age, Mr. Cort decided, or rather ages, for the double Georgian brick chimneys warred with the Queen Anne left front. He could just make out the date, 1703, at the base of the nearest chimney. All that wing must have been added later. Big place, marvellous bargain at 7,000. Can't understand it. How those windows with their little curved eyebrows seemed to frown down on one. And then he turned and examined the vistas. The trees were tinted exquisitely to an uncertain glory as the great red sinking sun flashed its rays on their crystal mantle. The Vale of Aylesbury was drowsing beneath a slowly deepening shroud of mist. Above it the hills, their crests rounded and shaded by silver and rose coppices, seemed to have set in them great smoky eyes of flame, where the last rays burned in them. "It is like some dream world," thought Mr. Cort. "It is curious how, wherever the sun strikes, it seems to make an eye, and each one fixed on me. Those hills, even those windows. But, judging from that mist, I shall have a slow journey home. I'd better have a quick look inside, though I have already taken a prejudice against the place. I hardly know why. Too lonely and isolated, perhaps." And then the eyes blinked and closed, and it was dark. He took a key from his pocket and went up 3 steps and thrust it into the keyhole of the massive oak door. The next moment he looked forward into absolute blackness, and the door swung to and closed behind him. This, of course, must be the palatial panelled hall which the agent described. He must strike a match and find the light switch. He fumbled in his pockets without success, and then he went through them again. He thought for a moment, "I must have left them on the seat in the car," he decided. "I'll go and fetch them. The door must be just behind me here." He turned and groped his way back, and then drew himself up sharply, for it had seemed that something had slipped past him, and then he put out his hands to touch the back of a chair, brocaded, he judged. He moved to the left of it and walked into a wall, changed his direction, went back past the chair, and found the wall again. He went back to the chair, sat down, and went through his pockets again, more thoroughly and carefully this time. Well, there was nothing to get fussed about. He was bound to find the door sooner or later. Now let him think. When he came in, he had gone straight back, because he'd stumbled into this chair. The door must be a little to the left or the right of it. He'd try each in turn. He turned to the left first, and found himself going down a little narrow passage. He could feel its sides when he stretched out his hands. Well then, he'd try his right. He did so, and walked into a wall. He groped his way along it, and again it seemed as if something slipped past him. "I wonder if there's a bat in here," he asked himself, and then found himself back at the chair. How Rachel would laugh if she could see him now. Surely he had a stray match somewhere. He took off his overcoat and ran his hands round the seam of every pocket, and then he did the same to the coat of his suit, and then he put them on again. Well, he'd try again. He'd follow the wall along. He did so, and found himself in a little narrow passage. Suddenly he shot out his right hand, for he had the impression that something had brushed his face very lightly. "I'm beginning to get a little bored with that bat, and with this blasted room generally," he said to himself. "I could imagine a more nervous person than myself getting a little fussed and panicky, but that's the one thing not to do." Ah, here was that chair again. Now, I'll try the wall the other side. Well, that seemed to go on forever, so he retraced his steps till he found the chair, and sat down again. He whistled a little snatch, resignedly. What an echo! The little tune had been flung back at him so fiercely, almost menacingly. Menacingly. That was just the feeble, panicky word a nervous person would use. Well, he'd go to the left again this time. As he got up, a quick spurt of cold air fanned his face. "Is anyone there?" he said. He had purposely not raised his voice. There was no need to shout. Of course, no one answered. Who could there have been to answer, since the caretaker was away? Now let him think it out. When he came in, he must have gone straight forward and then swerved slightly on the way back. Therefore, no, he was getting confused. At that moment, he heard the whistle of a train and felt reassured. The line from Wendover to Aylesbury ran half left from the front door, so it should be about there. He pointed with his finger, got up, groped his way forward, and found himself in a little narrow passage. Well, he must turn back and go to the right this time. He did so, and something seemed to slip just past him, and then he scratched his finger slightly on the brocade of the chair. Talk about a maze, he thought to himself. It's nothing to this. And then he said to himself, under his breath, "Curse this vile, God-forsaken place." A silly, panicky thing to do, he realized, almost as bad as shouting aloud. Well, it was obviously no use trying to find the door. He couldn't find it. Couldn't. He'd sit in the chair till the light came. He sat down. How very silent it was. His hands began searching in his pockets once more. Except for that sort of whispering sound over on the left somewhere. Except for that, it was absolutely silent. Except for that. What could it be? The caretaker was away. He turned his head slightly and listened intently. It was almost as if there were several people whispering together. One got curious sounds in old houses. How absurd it was. The chair couldn't be more than 3 or 4 yards from the door. There was no doubt about that. It must be slightly to one side or the other. He'd try the left once more. He got up and something lightly brushed his face. "Is anyone there?" he said, and this time he knew he had shouted. "Who touched me? Who's whispering? Where's the door?" What a nervous fool he was to shout like that. Yet someone outside might have heard him. He went groping forward again and touched a wall. He followed along it, touching it with his fingertips, and there was an opening. The door it must be, and he found himself going down a little narrow passage. He turned and ran back, and then he remembered. He had put a match booklet in his note-case. What a fool to have forgotten it, and make such an exhibition of himself. Yes, there it was. But his hands were trembling, and the booklet slipped through his fingers. He fell to his knees and began searching about on the floor. It must be just here. It can't be far. And then something icy cold and damp was pressed against his forehead. He flung himself forward to seize it, but there was nothing there. And then he leapt to his feet, and with tears streaming down his face, cried, "Who is there? Save me! Save me!" And then he began to run round and round, his arms outstretched. At last he stumbled against something, the chair, and something touched him as it slipped past. And then he ran screaming round the room, and suddenly his scream slashed back at him, for he was in a little, narrow passage. "Now, Mr. Runt," said the coroner, "you say you heard screaming coming from the direction of the manor. Why didn't you go to find out what was the matter?" "None of us chaps goes to manor after sundown," said Mr. Runt. "Oh, I know there's some absurd superstition about the house, but you haven't answered the question. There were screams, obviously coming from someone who wanted help. Why didn't you go to see what was the matter, instead of running away?" "None of us chaps goes to manor after sundown," said Mr. Runt. "Don't fence with the question. Let me remind you that the doctor said Mr. Cort must have had a seizure of some kind, but that had help been quickly forthcoming, his life might have been saved. Do you mean to tell me that, even if you had known this, you would still have acted in so cowardly a way?" Mr. Runt fixed his eyes on the ground and fingered his cap. "None of us chaps goes to manor after sundown," he repeated. The Third Coach by H.R. Wakefield. The only objection I have to the Royal Porrick Golf Club is that the 6th green is only separated by a narrow lane from the Royal Porrick Lunatic Asylum, or rather from its exercise enclosure, the saddest playground I have ever seen. So-called mad people fill me with dread, and yet a certain shamefaced fascination. There, but for the grace of God, goes Martin trapped, though why that grace stopped short of these poor lost souls is a curious mystery understood only by reverend gentlemen. So, whenever I was approaching the 6th green, a hole I played by some muscular aberration consistently well, I felt a flickering unease, hoping to heaven the inmates were locked in their cells. Yet if they were out at their pathetic exercises, I could not keep my eyes off them. There was one considerable compensation, however, in this proximity, for it was through it that I made the acquaintance of Lantern, one of the asylum doctors. I not only took a strong personal liking for him, but he interested me deeply. He is a distinguished alienist, and passionately absorbed in the study of insanity, and yet at the same time he detests his job. Many a time he has had to cancel around with me, and nearly always for the same reason, that he has been assaulted by a patient. Didn't get the hyoscine hydrobromide, or whatever it was, in quite quick enough, he will say, as he surveys me quizzingly, yet wearily, through a pair of rainbow eyes. And the asylum chairs are infernally hard. It took 4 of our strongest warders to keep him from creating a vacancy on the staff. As time went on, the strain began to tell, and he has lost his resiliency. But he has always remained a charming and, I felt, heroic person. He has promised to chuck it if he gets a definite danger signal, for he has the wrong temperament to resist the withering experiences of his day's work much longer. Those patients who are allowed out take their daily walk along a deserted by-road which runs parallel to the third hole, and one day when I was playing with Lantern, that shuffling, damned parade was passing by just as I hit a quick, short hook into the hedge bordering the road. As I walked towards it, my eye was caught by an individual walking alone and writing busily in a notebook. He was dressed in a round, clerical hat, a dog collar, a clerical frock coat, a pair of riding breeches, and brown boots. As I approached, he looked up at me with an extremely penetrating, cunning, and yet preoccupied expression on his face. And then he went on with his writing. When we had finished the round, I described him to Lantern and asked who he was. "The Reverend Wellington Scott," he replied, "and a very curious case. If you would like to know more, come down to my study this evening. That's all about him now." When I arrived at the asylum, Lantern was just about to set out on his evening round. He went to a drawer and got out a notebook. "Read this while I'm away. I'll be back in about an hour. There are the drinks and the goldflakes." When he had gone, I picked up the notebook and saw that it was filled with a very delicate script. I began to read. I remember that the reason for my being in the Pantham district that day was that I was paying a visit to a widowed lady of means, whom I wished to interest in a benefit scheme. A benefit scheme is a scheme which benefits me. I was Mr. Robert Porter on this occasion. £10 richer than when I left it, I was approaching Pantham Station along a small road which topped the railway embankment. I noticed casually a train approaching. It was too early to be mine, when suddenly I saw sparks flashing up from it. It rocked violently, left the rails, and crashed into a bridge. I saw that the third coach was smashed to matchwood, and bodies were hurled from it onto the side of the embankment. I started to run, not for assistance, as you might naturally but erroneously imagine, but to get the story through to the evening news, which might well result in my returning £20 to the good. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks, for I subconsciously realized there had been something very peculiar about that accident. What was it? And then I knew. I had not heard a sound. I ran back to the top of the embankment, and there was merely a placid row of metals shining in the sun. Whereupon I sat down on the grass and thought things over. Like most superior men, I am somewhat superstitious. I was, therefore, convinced that there was some reason why I, alone of all mankind, should have been vouchsafed this vision. The only supernatural personage for whom I have any respect is the devil, for I believe he looks after his own, which is more than can be said for any of the more reputable deities. I regarded this singular apparition as a hint from him, and carefully recalled the hour of its occurrence in my notebook. I inquired casually at the station, and found there was no train passing Pantham at that time. The vision, then, probably referred to the future, to some new train not yet in Bradshaw. There were many conceivable ways by which I might benefit by a railway accident. The editor of Truth, for example, might be in that third coach, or various other personages whose demise would not be regretted by me. Pursuing this train of thought, I journeyed back to London. Now, I have described myself as a superior man. I had better explain that. A superior man is one who rises superior to his environment. All great moralists, from Mr. Pecksniff to the Bishop of London, would agree with me there. Again, a superior man is one who, by grasping some simple principle concerning humanity, and acting ingeniously upon that knowledge, makes a satisfactory livelihood. 95% of human beings are mugs, for example, which is the one I have acted upon. The Bishop and Mr. Pecksniff might shake their heads over this, but I am convinced it is true. My father followed a peculiar profession. He conveyed second-rate racehorses from one part of the globe to another. Sometimes he'd be conducting a brace of duds to Jamaica, or over to Ireland or France. He received frequent bites and hacks from his charges, but he expected them, and, I believe, was invariably kind to these glorified screws. Consequently, he was away a great deal, but as this traffic was sporadic, had much spare time, most of which he spent in conveying pints of stout from a pot to his belly. My mother was a good-tempered slut, and the only quarrel she ever had with the pater concerned their respective shares of that filthy fluid. Apart from her good temper and her thirst, there is nothing to record concerning her. My father, a squat, bow-legged little gnome, had that complete, unquestioning belief in the mingled credulity and rascality of his fellow men, which those who are connected professionally with the sport of kings invariably share. Racing, he was wont to declare, consists of mugs, bloody mugs, crooks, bloody crooks, and horses. "And which are you?" asked my mother. "I ain't neither. I just helps the crooks to skin the mugs by moving about the horses. I've seen too much of it. I've seen blokes who was pretty artful at the doings in the ornery way become just too bloody silly whenever they hear the bookies' chorus." He was so convinced of the peculiar opportunities afforded to bookmakers for plumbing the depths of human simplicity that he suggested having me apprentice to their profession, but my mother threw a pot at his head for suggesting it. "I didn't bear my boy to be a bookie," was her inflexible decision. All the same, these repeated references to mugs and crooks had the effect of convincing my childish mind that the world was entirely peopled by these two classes. As an example of the lasting effect of those lessons learnt in infancy, I remain of that opinion to this day. Most of the money for my education went to quenching my parents' thirst, but I was taught to read and write, and acquired the rest myself. In my errand-boy days, the only literature I could afford was a newspaper, but this was sufficient to enable me to test the truth of my father's generalization. For the most part, it seemed to me triumphantly to support it. Let me give a few examples. The head of the firm for which I worked was one of the greatest commercial figures in England, and the papers frequently contained articles from his secretary's pen, dilating on the blessings of thrift, hard work, and early marriage to Miss Wright. Yes, he actually used that expression. Yet everyone from the managing director to myself knew that he gambled wildly, ill-treated his wife, and kept a succession of decorative harpies labelled dancing girls. Then one of our assistants helped herself to the till and was given 3 months. She was anemic, scrawny, middle-aged, yet the papers described her as a pretty girl. I marked that down. Obviously, for some obscure reason, the populate preferred their minor female criminals to be pretty, and the papers fostered this harmless inanity. I found eventually that this rule applies to all women under 50 who earn mentions in the press. Again, we resided in a semi-slum near the Marylebone Road, and one of our neighbours brought to a close an argument with another of our neighbours with a chopper. The papers described this as a West End chopper attack, yet anything less West End, as I understood the expression, than Milk Row was hard to imagine. I marked that too. Obviously, the populace found something more stimulating in a West End chopper attack than in a chopper attack in other areas. This extraordinary psychological mystery took me some time to solve, but I learnt to understand it perfectly. And so, as I matured and read and read and read, I realized that there is an absolute and comprehensive difference between life as it appears in the press and life as it really is. I shall not enlarge upon that. For anyone who compares what he reads in the papers about sex, religion, sport, business, the theatre, the many-coloured globe of human activity, with what he experiences himself, knows this to be beyond dispute. When I had proved to my satisfaction that my father was right, I thought very hard. 95% of human beings must like to be mugs and mugged, I decided, must prefer soft tales to hard truths. They must find a solace and a stimulant in being incessantly bamboozled by the other 5%. Newspaper proprietors, bookies, bishops, financiers, and politicians. Certainly, there must be a percentage of mugs amongst these professional men, but roughly they represent my father's crooks. In other words, exploiters of the mass credulity of the 95%. This is not a thesis on human behavior, so suffice it to say that I eventually definitely decided the inhabitants of Great Britain were 95% mugs and 5% crooks, and I used to find great amusement and instruction in following the workings of this truth down the most obscure and unexpected byways of our comic civilization. I was then 18, a very junior clerk. Not to act upon a profound conviction is laziness and cowardice, so I had to make up my mind which I was to be, mug or crook, exploiter or exploited. With the necessity for this decision harshly exercising my mind, I went to the White City one evening to observe the reactions of humanity to the spectacle of a succession of thin, rather graceful hounds in pursuit of a metal mechanism, which I discovered about as much resembled a hare as poor Miss Flint resembled a pretty girl. As a spectacle, it had its points. That deep, dark pool circumscribed by a green and tan track, the focus of the eyes of 95,000 half-wits and 5,000 live-by-wits, the curious, surging, harsh hum of the worst 100,000, the sudden appearance in the distance of a half a dozen tiny white two-legged figures, with still tinier four-legged figures pacing beside them, wandering round the vast arena till they reached a sort of chicken house, into which the two-legged hoisted the dangling four-legged, who, stirred by the sound of a bell and the sight of an individual ascending a peculiarly lousy tower, whimpered and grumbled and thrust eager paws through the bars. All this was admirably calculated to put the mugs into the right mood for the crook's purposes. I wandered about amongst the excited, liquor-sprung horde, fighting their way to rows of leather-lunged sharps who, wedged like unsavory sardines, bellowed out their inane jargon and exchanged pieces of cardboard with their lamentable faces gummed upon them for the silver and paper of the triumphs of evolution. And I made up my mind. Some exploiter, a politician as far as I remember, once, in a gust of vote-snatching sentimentality, declared he was on the side of the angels. He would have been hard put to find an ally at the White City, and he would certainly not have found one in me. It would be humiliating and debasing to be a private in the ranks of muggery, far better to be an officer and a crook. Only so could I keep my self-respect. I considered that this was the decision of a philosopher and a superior man, and I have never changed my opinion. How to begin? I carefully studied the pages of Truth, an organ I have always found most useful. It is an encyclopedia of muggery. Its editor has kept on my track, but he is at a hopeless disadvantage, for there is a sucker born every minute, and a reader of Truth perhaps once a day, odds too great even for a Labouchere. The present editor is a charming personality, and I have to thank his ably conducted periodical for many of my most remunerative conceptions, but I'd have liked him in that third coach all the same. I decided to make a beginning with a begging letter. It hardly sounded like that, for it was manly, suggesting rows of medals, a patient little wife, and many hostages to fortune. It ended with a pathetic suggestion of suicide and a defiant repudiation of the dole. I sent this to a carefully selected list, and netted £84, 13 shillings, 2pence. And then I knew that bounding sense of exhilaration which a man gains from finding that he is desired for success in his life's work. Shortly after, I noticed one who was clearly a policeman in mufti hanging about, so I changed my address. A week later, Truth had a paragraph about me, and was good enough to congratulate me on my epistolary skill, which, it suggested, would eventually bring me to a place where I should have few opportunities of exercising it. My next conception concerned that shocking instance of human callousness, the holiday cat, or rather the cat that doesn't get a holiday or a square saucer of milk when its thoughtless owner is at Southend. In a carefully composed epistle, I reminded a large number of maiden ladies of this sickening victimization, and stated that I should devote any funds provided to the cause of feline felicity. I enclosed with it a portrait of a tortoise-shell animal in an advanced state of emaciation. £122, 10 shillings, 3 and 3 farthings, and another change of address. This time Truth sat up and took notice. By a flash of genius, it suggested that the honest victim of circumstances, Wilfred Town, and the humane cat-lover, John Reddy, were one and the same person, and expressed the opinion that this combined individual was well worthy of mention in its cautionary list. From these crude beginnings, I advanced to far greater subtlety and versatility, till I was making a steady £2,000 a year, sometimes more. But for one thing I could have retired long ago, and that is the scandalous and narrow-minded and anachronistic bar which prevents women from entering the Church of England ministry. Clergymen are no good for charitable schemes, but they are invariably attracted by possibilities of getting a new suit of clothes by means of a little investment proposition. Maiden ladies, while they like a flutter at times, are splendidly charitable. The combination of these two, a maiden lady parson. Well, it's time our legislators were up and doing. I was convicted once, but knowing more than a little law, got off on appeal, and Truth exuberation was short-lived. I have had 74 aliases and 74 changes of address. Except in their charitable aspect, I had practically no dealings with women for many years, but then it occurred to me that the right type might be useful to me for business purposes. There are many little jobs for which a woman is better than a man. One of them is getting money out of men. I didn't mean to embark upon blackmail. It earns too long a sentence nowadays, and is extremely hazardous, but it is possible for women to get money from men without going to extreme lengths. I resolved to keep my eyes open. It was about this time that I had that curious experience at Pantham. I was having tea at an ABC shop one afternoon when the waitress banged down my cup and splashed some of its contents over my spats. I began to remonstrate angrily, and found myself looking into a pair of black, indomitable eyes, battle, murder, and sudden death eyes. So I laughed it off and began watching her as she went from table to table. She was tall and powerfully built, and her face, I was convinced, was that sort which compels men, for some queer reason which has always been a mystery to me, to behave in fatuous, unexpected, and erratic ways. I could see by the expression on it that she was furiously discontented and in the mood to do something drastic and dangerous to improve her lot. In the mood to exploit male mugs, I diagnosed. I returned to the shop the next day and had a few words with her, but those few words on my part were very carefully chosen, and she agreed to dine with me that night. She was in the mood I had guessed, prepared to slip a double dose of strychnine into every cup of tea, coffee, or bovril in the establishment. She passionately desired pretty clothes, ease, and power. She expressed utter contempt for every member of my sex. I believed her when she said she was a virgin. Very gently and delicately, I began to explain my means of livelihood, and suggested she should come into partnership. This delicacy I found was quite unnecessary, for she agreed with enthusiasm, and like a true enthusiast expressed herself ready to begin work at once. We started to live together the next day, quite platonically, I may say. I spent £200 on a trousseau for her, and carefully instructed her in the technique of her business. She was a wonderfully apt pupil, and quick study. Within a week, she had a wealthy married member of the stock exchange neatly on the hook. We had agreed that she should retain 75% of any small sums and the value of any present she received. And when I say that my 25% represented £84 in 5 months, the generosity of this expert in American rails cannot be questioned. But then he began to get a little frightened and rather bored, and he gave Charity to understand that she was about to have a more amenable successor. The critical moment. Now blackmail was barred, so Charity merely rang him up at his home and his office about 10 times a day, and he found her waiting for him, weeping bitterly every time he entered and left the exchange, much to his chagrin and the amusement of the men at the door and his fellow members. There is no law against ringing up businessmen at home or at the office, or exhibiting all the symptoms of a broken heart in Threadneedle Street. However, much susceptible stockbrokers may regret the fact. Charity acted beautifully, and I believe aroused genuine sympathy in the breast of this speculator's solicitor, as he handed her a cheque for £2,000, which she and I divided equally, as per contract, and she was brilliantly still a virgin. I grew to admire her greatly, and though we had no sexual relationship whatsoever, sometimes when I heard her turning over in bed, or saw her coming back naked from her bath, I knew vague stirrings and excitement. But I repressed them vigorously, and indeed they were never much more than the ripples on a pond, as compared with the combers off the horn of the average mug. Our combined income for the next 3 years averaged £5,000, not 1 penny of which went into the coffers of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. By now, I was a badly wanted and notorious person, but I have a sixth sense for evading the constable, and I could see retirement and ease before me very soon, when the one thing I had considered inconceivable happened. Charity fell in love with a poor man in the middle stage of consumption, who most improvidently and prematurely caused her to be with child. After she had told me this, she cut short my remonstrances and protests by informing me she must have money to marry on, and that I must supply it to the tune of £2,000 a year for 6 years. I replied I would make it £200 a year for 3 years, and not a penny more. In that case, she said, I go round to the editor of Truth tomorrow and tell him everything. And ruin yourself? I replied. What's come over you? Be sensible. Have the baby quietly, leave this young dying fool forever, and concentrate on business. A child might be useful to us. I'll think that point over. I shouldn't waste your valuable time if I were you, she answered, and don't be too sure I shall ruin myself. You're the big game they're after. If I give you away, they won't bother about me, and I doubt if they could convict me anyway. And I don't mind betting the papers will pay me anything I like to ask for my story after you've been jugged. Give me time to think, I said. Was she bluffing? I didn't believe so. She was probably right. The police would merely use her as evidence against me, and she would be able to get thousands of pounds for her version of the last 3 years. Yet pay her £2,000 a year for 6 years? It would just not ruin me, and she knew it. The gross ingratitude. I tried to get her to lower her terms, but she was adamant. I don't feel well, and am going down to Folkestone tomorrow for a week. I shall expect your answer directly I return, was her ultimatum. I spent the most wretched night of my life. I saw all that I had planned for going by the board. Sooner or later, I should be forced into extreme recklessness by this dreadful drain on my resources, and then 10 years' hard labor at least. This little vixen I had reared. making her teeth meet in the hand which had fed her for the sake of some broken-lunged piece of worm fodder. I'd like to have flung her into a cell full of drunken stokers. And then I dozed off, and woke in the most confident, buoyant mood. That is why I am superstitious, for I've had this experience several times. Just when I have felt that I was trapped at last, I have had these sudden flashes of confidence and ease, and always something has happened to save me. It would come this time. I went to see Charity off, pretending to be in despair, and imploring her to make some concession. "Oh, shut up," she said. "I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for Jim. He's sweet and he's straight, and I love him. Words you don't know the meaning of, you mixture of dirty crook and frozen fish. So you can work for him or go to Clink and work for His Majesty, and you've got a week to choose." She had just got into a coach about halfway up the train, and I was about to leave when my eye was caught by an individual in clerical attire who was sauntering down the platform and glancing sharply at the people upon it. As he drew near, he seemed vaguely familiar to me. Suddenly he saw me and gave me a quick, meaning look. He passed close to me, and as he went past he said slowly and distinctly, "There's more room in the third coach." The third coach! The third coach! And in a flash I saw a third coach turn to matchwood. "There's more room in front, Charity," I said. "Come along." The compartment was packed, and she came readily. Just as we reached the third coach, the whistle went, and I bundled her into a compartment already filled to the brim. She gave me a venomous glance as the train pulled out, and then I looked round for that slightly familiar individual. He was far down the platform by now, but he turned round, saw me, waved his hand, and disappeared. As the train was passing out, I happened to catch my reflection in a window glass, and then I knew why he had seemed familiar, for his face was mine. I left the station and took a taxi to Pantham Station. During the hour's run, I was in a state of high excitement. About a mile from the station, we were stopped by a policeman. "You can't go down this road," he said. "There's been a smash on the line." "What train?" I asked anxiously. "The Down Folkestone Express." "My God!" I cried. "I had a friend in it." "Well," he said, "they've got the killed and injured on the side of the embankment. You'd better go down there. Anyway, they want help." It wasn't a pleasant sight. I identified Charity by the remnant of her watch garter, which was still hanging to what had been her leg. Then, saying nothing to anyone, I went away. Otherwise, she was never identified. And then, for some reason or other, I became a clergyman. I don't really know why. In fact, I think I've become that individual who told me about that third coach. Here, the delicate little script came to an end, and a moment later Lantern came back. "Finished?" he asked. "Well, what do you think of it?" "A very rascally and curious tale," I replied. "But the most curious part of it is," said Lantern, "that there's not a word of truth in it." "What?" "The Reverend Wellington Scott was a mild, timid East End curate. Going down for a holiday to Folkestone, he was in the Pantham disaster, and hurled from the third coach onto his head. He was unconscious for 10 days, and when he came to, he had to come here. He spends every moment writing that story in notebooks. He completes it twice a week. We read it carefully to see if his narrative ever changes, but it is always word for word the same. He is very docile and easy to manage so long as he is allowed to write. For an experiment, we took his writing materials away, whereupon he delivered himself of the most appalling filth and blasphemy I have ever heard. He never speaks unless he is spoken to. When he first came in, his face was round, chuggy, and ingenuous in expression. It has slowly lengthened, hardened, and its expression has become cunning, watchful, and malevolent. That is the story of the Reverend Wellington Scott. And the explanation? I asked. Lantern shrugged his shoulders. How can there be one? I have known somewhat similar cases, though never so perfect, where some injury to the head has changed the disposition and to some extent the memory, but, as I say, never to this extent. As a matter of fact, one can find traces of the curate in that narrative. A quotation from Shelley, a familiarity with strange types, a distaste for sex and so on, and, of course, the closing sentences. Otherwise he is, as he appears in his story, the precise opposite of what he actually was. Perhaps you may have missed almost the most remarkable thing. His description of the accident, as seen in his vision, is precisely identical with that of the two eyewitnesses of it. Yet, of course, he never could have seen it, and he hasn't read a word since he recovered consciousness. I said just now there wasn't a word of truth in that narrative, but that, in a sense, is presumptuous and unscientific. The fashionable theory today is that we each one of us create our own particular God and our own particular universe. It is subjectivity's innings. We certainly create our own truths. Fortunately, in the case of most of us, our truth roughly corresponds with the truth of others. The Reverend Wellington Scott's violently diverges, so we have to lock him up. He has been here a year, and I found he went to a greyhound racing meeting at the White City the night before the accident. Would you like to see him again? Yes and no. On the whole, yes. Lantern took me along a corridor and unlocked a door. The Reverend Wellington Scott was seated at a table, his face partly shaded by a reading lamp. He was writing busily, but looked up after a moment and shot that penetrating glance at me. I hope you have everything you want, Mr. Scott, said Lantern. Yes, thank you, sir, he replied, in the mild, slightly clipped, slightly sing-song voice of a stage curate. But I have one little question to ask of you. Should the words watch-garter be hyphenated, in your opinion, or not? Hyphenated, I think, replied Lantern. I am much obliged to you, and glad to find that we are in agreement. I suppose, sir, I shall be here for some little time yet? Oh, yes, just for a little while longer, said Lantern. Good night. Good night, sir, he replied, his pencil already busy again. Poor devil, I said, as we walked back to Lantern's study. Is he happy? Perfectly, replied Lantern. There ought to be a deep truth hidden somewhere in that fact. And now for a drink. Look Up There by H.R. Wakefield. Why did he always stare up? And why did he so worry Mr. Packard by doing it? The latter had come to Briony to read and to rest, and to take the bare minimum of notice of his fellow men. Doctor's orders. And here he was, preoccupied, almost obsessed, by the garish idiosyncrasy of this tiny, hen-eyed fellow. He was not a taking specimen of humanity, for his forehead was high and receding, his nose beaked fantastically, and the skin stretched so tightly across it that it seemed as if it might be ripped apart at any moment. Then he had a long, thin-lipped mouth always slightly open, and a pointed beard which, like his hair, was fussy and unkempt. He was forever in the company of a stalwart yokel, a South Country enlisted guardsman to the life, a slow-moving, massive, red-faced plebeian who seemed a master of the desirable art of aphasia, for no word ever seemed to pass his lips. But good heavens, how he ploughed and furrowed the menu! Mr. Packard was a very important civil servant, and contrary to the opinion of the vulgar, civil servants sometimes overwork. The notion that they arrive at their offices just in time for lunch, and return again to them just in time to sign a few letters and catch a train home, is a fantasy derived from newspapers, and therefore from newspaper proprietors. Idle fellows, as a rule, for all they have to do is propagate ideas and employ other people to carry them out. Anyone can have ideas. It is the carrying them out which means work. Mr. Packard had ideas, usually very judicious and admirable ideas, and he also had to carry them out, which meant work, eventually overwork, a threatened nervous breakdown, peremptory advice from a specialist, and 3 months' leave. He had been recommended Brioni in June, because it was between seasons for that green and placid isle, and there was plenty of sun. Gentle breezes blown over a purple sea, very purple, very warm, very salt. A golf course with 7 short holes, and a reasonable tariff. Perched primly in the Adriatic, it offered every possible advantage, every chance of speedy convalescence to an overworked bachelor 52 years of age, with nothing whatsoever organically wrong with him. So Mr. Packard had found it, till his eye had been caught by this curious couple, one who never spoke, but stolidly filled his belly, the other who was no more communicative, and forever stared upwards at an angle of 35 degrees. For such Mr. Packard, after an exasperating calculation, estimated it to be. On the first occasion he had noticed him, Mr. Packard had instinctively stared up also, wondering what object of interest was to be found on the bare, brimstone-tinted wall of the dining-room at an angle of 35 degrees about. But there was nothing. Yet this midget had continued to gaze up, even while eating his fish and emptying his glass. And his companion, that burly proletarian, appeared entirely unconcerned. Again Mr. Packard's eyes tilted in sympathy, only to encounter a bare, brimstone wall. It then occurred to him that this angular obsession must be of long standing, for its victim most expertly neutralized what must have been a heavy handicap to accurate feeding by an impressive dexterity in the manipulation of knives and forks and spoons, though his appetite seemed as slender as his physical frame. So stern and uncompromising had been the specialist's fiat that Mr. Packard had been genuinely alarmed about his nerves, so much so that he almost entertained the possibility that this upward-peering absurdity was a figment of his disordered imagination, a very unlovely thought. But he had dismissed it with a very comforting reassurance, when he saw that others among the sparse company then visiting Brioni were also puzzled by this singular prepossession of the hen-eyed fellow. What an incongruous couple they were! And why didn't the lusty rustic turn his eyes up too, or do something about it? Well, let him take a leaf out of his book and pay no regard to what was none of his business, and certainly no part of his cure. If the fellow wanted to stare up, let him. So, by making a considerable effort, Mr. Packard looked away. All the same, he was charged with a tantalizing and hard-to-exercise curiosity about this couple, their circumstances, the connection between them, all this. But, above all, why the devil the tiny one stared up. Knowing such wonderings could only delay the healing of the lesion in his nervous system, he made quite elaborate plans for avoiding the pair. He changed the times of his meals, and if he saw them in a room, he went to another, and if he observed them coming towards him, he turned on his heel. By these means he freed his mind of them to some extent, but a sneaking, insidious inquisitiveness endured. However, the sun and air and peace of Brioni rapidly restored him, and once again he slept an unbroken 8 hours. He found himself with such an appetite as he had not known for 20 years, and the idea that there was someone standing just behind him all the time, A very irritating symptom, this. Most absolutely and blessedly ceased. So, reassuringly soon, his inner eye began to turn longingly to a snug, though austere office in Whitehall, with neatly raised pyramids of jackets and official documents of undeniable secrecy and import, and to that leisurely stroll up to the club at 1 o'clock so punctually, and that carefully chosen little lunch, and perhaps a game of chess with Lenton, some gossip, and a leisurely stroll back to the Home Office, where there would be decisions to make, questions in the House to consider, a feeling of slight but pleasing importance, and all that regulated system and ordered regime which suited him temperamentally so perfectly. A holiday in August seemed a justifiable weakness to him, but to idle about in dreamy, flashing dark green islands in June was abnormal, a process which should not be prolonged for an unnecessary second. He would stick it out for a week or two longer, and count the days till the hour of his release should strike, release from indolence, strolling about, and from an inclination to uneasy, vague surmisings concerning an ill-assorted couple, one of whom forever raised his eyes in a sort of viewless intensity, and the other who never spoke but was forever at his side. On the evening before his departure, about 6 o'clock, Mr. Packard strolled along the path through the Holm Oaks towards the bathing place, and sat down on a seat overlooking the shadowed and darkening straits of the Istrian shore. Shadowed and darkening, because a slowly marshalling army of clouds was rising above the Dolomites and frowning down over Trieste. The sun, resisting and not yet overpowered, hurled red and gold shafts up through the advancing host. The spectacle had a certain sombre sublimity, and its leisurely shifting pattern pleasantly absorbed Mr. Packard's attention, so much so that when a rather high-pitched and deliberate voice remarked, "Some persons have found in such spectacles evidence of the existence of a god," he started abruptly, and half rose from his seat. He must have been half asleep, for he found sitting on the same seat beside him that enigmatic pair, the little one next to him, and the yokel on his other side, smoking a pipe and staring out to sea. Mr. Packard was irritated and taken by surprise, but his natural good manners and subconscious curiosity prevented him from uttering the tart and snubby retort which half rose to his lips. Instead, he said dryly, "The particular deity concerned is most certainly Jupiter Pluvius. I imagine that Trieste will get the full benefit of that storm soon, and it will be our turn in an hour or so." "From your tone," suggested the little man, "I judge you are of a sceptical turn of mind." "And what the devil has it got to do with you if I am?" thought Mr. Packard. "If you mean," he said, "that I do not see why all that is beautiful should be put to the credit of what you call God, that is so. For in whom do you lodge the responsibility for the somewhat less palatable spectacles provided by bullfights and battlefields, unless you're a duellist?" "Very possibly I am," said the little man, staring up at the fading sun, now drowning in a majestically pacing cloud ocean. "Well," said Mr. Packard, "it will be the devil's turn soon enough. Storms in this region are no joke." "I think I have reason to believe in the devil," continued the little man, taking off his rusty Panama and placing it on the ground beside him. As he said this, the yokel looked at him sharply, then knocked out his pipe on his boot and began filling it again from an aluminium box. "Oh, indeed," replied Mr. Packard, his curiosity rising. "I have myself deduced him logically, but I take it you have had a closer view of him." "Yes," answered the little man, his eyes on the rim of the advancing storm. "I think I can say that. Would you like to hear about it?" "Certainly," said Mr. Packard. "I'm glad of that, because it is a relief to me to tell it now and again. Does Gauntry Hall convey anything to you?" "Gauntry Hall," repeated Mr. Packard uncertainly. "The name seems vaguely familiar." It was a famous show place burnt down in 1904. I was there that night." "Oh, I remember now," said Mr. Packard. "Middle Tudor, near Leicester, famous chiefly for its long gallery. And wasn't there some legend about it?" "Yes," replied the little man, "and the fact that you can recall so much is a great tribute to your memory. Oh, I was rather keen on that period once upon a time when I was less busy. I went up to Oxford the same term as Jack Gauntry, and to the same college, Oriel," continued the little man, his eyes narrowed and shifting and busy with the sky. "In those days I was keenly interested in the occult. I believe it to have been somewhat of a pose, a dangerous pose. I knew there was some queer story about Gauntry Hall, and made up my mind I would get Jack to tell me about it. Not a very creditable ambition, but I was young and foolish, and I have been punished enough. We became great friends, and one evening I had my chance. He came up to my rooms rather late one night, late in November 1896, after dining out. He was a little drunk, and still thirsty. I filled him up, and finally brought the subject round to Gauntry Hall. "Funny you should mention it," he said. "My people did the annual trek to London today." "How do you mean, annual trek?" I asked. He did not answer for a moment, and I could see he was torn between two impulses, one to cleanse his bosom of this family obsession, the other to keep his mouth dutifully shut. So I gave him another whisky and soda. He drank it in a gulp, and then became muzzy and garrulous. I could see he would find relief in being unrestrainedly indiscreet. "I'm not boring you?" "Not in the least," Mr. Packard reassured him. "Well, suddenly Jack blurted out, 'No one's allowed to be in the house New Year's Eve.' "Why not?" "Oh, because the bogeyman gets busy then. As a matter of fact, no one is supposed to have spent New Year's Eve at Gauntry for 300 years. So as not to make it too conspicuous, we always clear out during the last week in November. Perhaps it's all bosh. I sometimes wonder. Anyway, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I'm slightly tight, and shall tell you some more." I was feeling rather ashamed of myself, and it was on the tip of my tongue to shut him up. But I didn't. No one's allowed there on New Year's Eve, but early next morning old Carrow, the butler, the Carrows have been in our service for years and years, comes to the house and opens all the windows, one after the other, and shuts them again. The hell of a job. All but one, the one in the middle of the first floor of the south wing. And out of this one he has to hang a white silk banner, which is in the long gallery, and wave it 3 times very slowly, and then, shall I tell you what he has to do then? "No," I said, for I knew I was hearing what I should not, and that I should be bitterly repentant if I let him go on. "Shut up, and I'll forget what you've told me." This seemed to sober him up. "Yes, I hope you will," he replied, and got up and left the room. We never referred to the subject again. I spent half the summer vacation at Gauntry Hall for the 4 years I was up. It was an exquisite house, gloriously placed, and the grounds were perfection. But you remember it, so I need not describe it. Sir John and Lady Gauntry were sweet survivals from an easier age, a type which began to disappear with the introduction of modern plumbing from America. They were rather slow and faded. Their manners were a heritage, their benign suzerainty over the local serfs and villains a sharp reminder that there was something in consonance with society in the feudal system. Well, they are dust by now. I grew to love the old place. Its atmosphere seemed so placid, untroubled, unshakable in those long, lovely summer days that I could hardly believe it was ever visited by a curious winter spell, that it ever could cease to drowse and become most malignantly awake. The subject was never alluded to within its walls, but I remember I used to find my eyes wandering up to that window in the middle of the south wing. Yes, I used to find myself looking up. That was all. At least I think that was all. Though one evening, when I was taking a stroll after dinner, I happened to glance up at this window, and for a second it seemed as if something white fluttered from it and disappeared. But it may have been a projection from my own mind. And then came the Boer War, and Jack went out with his yeomanry and was killed on the Modder. The shock drove the old couple into complete seclusion, and they died within a few days of each other early in 1903. Meanwhile, I had completely lost touch with Gauntry Hall, and then one day I met Teller, the agent, in the street, and he lunched with me. He told me the estate had been leased to people called Relf, nouveau riches. Young Relf was the son of a millionaire multiple shop owner in the north, and he had married some little vulgarian. Teller utterly despised these town-bred parvenus, and considered their occupation of Gauntry defiling and almost intolerable. But they may not be there much longer, he said, for the damn fools are going to spend New Year's Eve in the house. What? I cried. Oh yes, he replied. They are greatly looking forward to it. I felt it my duty to warn them, but I might have saved myself the trouble, for when I had said my piece, that little barmaid, Mrs. Relf, who looks like a painted Pekingese, clapped her hands on her knees and declared she simply adored ghosts, didn't believe in them a bit, would have a house party for the occasion, and wish a very happy new year to whoever or whatever came. I reminded her she was preparing to break a rule which had lasted for 300 years. Quite time it was broken, said she. So I shrugged my shoulders and gave it up. I wish them luck. All the same, I said, it's one of the most interesting pieces of news I've heard for a long time. Well, if you think that, why don't you make one of the party? Asked Teller, laughing. How could I? I don't know them. Oh, that doesn't matter. They're very partial to peers. I was about to say no, most emphatically, when I was seized by a most violent temptation. Here were these fools prepared to put this most ancient and vague and famous mystery to the test. It was a unique opportunity. Dangerous? Yes, probably, but the old house had always seemed friendly to me. Here was I, a professed student of the occult, presented with a glorious opportunity for investigation. If I failed to take it, I should never forgive myself, nor have any respect for myself. I imagine you can sympathize with my feelings to some extent. Oh, yes, replied Mr. Packard. No doubt I should have done as I infer you did. Yes, I accepted. As the little man said this, Mr. Packard noticed the yokel glance across at him, and as their eyes met it seemed as though the fellow wished to convey a message of some sort. A warning, was it? Yes, continued the little man. I accepted. Teller fixed up the invitation for me, and I reached Leicester Station about 5:30 on New Year's Eve, 23 years ago. The moment I got into the trap, and we began to drive eastward through rows of dingy villas, I began to feel a nervous irritation which steadily increased as we drove towards Gauntry. It was a foul night, blowing very hard and sleeting, and every yard we travelled made me wish the more I hadn't come. I could feel the influence of Gauntry reaching out and attempting to repel me. I'd have gone straight back to the station but for one thing. Supposing I funked it and nothing happened. That story might get round, which wouldn't have been pleasant. All the same, when we reached the house, it took all my resolution to cross its threshold. The old place had always seemed so friendly and welcoming before. Now it was sullen and utterly hostile. I felt as if I were a traitor, as if I'd been caught by my best friend in the act of forging his name. I was so seized by dread and nervously unstrung that I hardly noticed the rest of the party. I remember there were 10 of us, 5 women and 5 men, and that they all appeared to be young, noisy and vulgar, so noisy that I was convinced they had had a good many of the primitive cocktails which they were drinking as I arrived, and presently I knew they were almost as full of dread and as unstrung as myself. The house seemed throbbing with a sinister rhythm. It seemed as if it had summoned the great wind which leaped at it in gigantic gusts. By coming there that day, I had incurred its malignant enmity, and with cold austerity it was bidding me begone. I had my old room in the east wing, but when I went up to dress, It was as though an almost materialized force was disputing my entry. I had to breast my way through it as through a hostile tide. I found they had decided to dine in the great hall instead of the dining room. Why, I don't know. Round it ran a balcony, from which a door led through to the famous long gallery. When we sat down, I knew them all to be suffering from an acute spiritual malaise, and that what they had drunk, far from lulling their sensitiveness to the power which menaced them, had but weakened their resistance to it. How soon will the storm break? In 10 minutes or so, replied Mr. Packard. I am surprised it has not broken before now. It is reserving all its venom for us. Then I may have just time to finish. I do not remember whether I spoke a word throughout that meal, but I do know that I was under such a strain that I had to grip my chair to stop myself running from the room. The women were on the verge of hysteria. The men drank feverishly, and, as time went on, a dreadful, vague, inane babble came from all of them. The woman on my right, she had a high, thin voice, suddenly gulped down a full glass of champagne, some of which swilled over her chin and neck, and shouted, "Well, when does it begin?" and then went off into peals of hysterical laughter. We did not move from the table, and from 10:30 onwards, Ralph kept getting up to ring the bell, but no servant appeared. "Where are those bloody slaves?" he cried each time, and staggered back to the table and filled his glass again. From 11:30 I was no longer master of myself. The room was thick with smoke which wreathed itself into fantastic patterns. The pressure grew unendurable, and suddenly my resistance broke, and I ran from the great hall up to my room and lay cowering on my bed. I could still hear the crazy, chaotic babble from those I had left, and then a great bell crashed out. 1, 2, 3, and each mighty stroke followed so hard on its predecessor that the vile jangle almost seemed an undivided sound. It was as if a murderer was hammering in my brain. Suddenly it ceased, and I heard no sound from below. And then came one high, piercing scream from a woman, "Look up there!" and then every light in the house went out. Well, when that happened, I groped round the room for my electric torch. At last I found it, and I think if I had not found it just then, I should have suffered even more than I have suffered. I staggered downstairs and into the great hall, and flashed the lamp on the table. They were all sitting rigidly, their eyes looking up and focused on the door into the long gallery. I peered into their faces one by one. Their eyes were wide, yet drawn in as though asquint. Their heads were strained back on their shoulders. Their mouths were open, and foam was on their lips. And then I flashed my torch up towards the door into the long gallery. And there, the cloud army had advanced so far that it was looming down on them. 2 striding horns of vapour preceded it. As the little man cried, and there, a blinding flash leapt from one to the other, so that these enflamed and curled tentacles drove down at them, or so it seemed most terrifyingly to Mr. Packard, and the rending crash of thunder which followed hard upon it hurled its echoes round the world. And then, with inchoate fury, the storm drove forward to the attack, and then the little man leapt to his feet and flung his arms above his head and screamed out as though in agony, "Look up there! Look up there!" Mr. Packard moved towards him, but in a second the yokel had him by the shoulders. "Leave him to me," he shouted against the thunder. "I know what to do." And he began to propel the little man before him. Mr. Packard, oblivious of the rain, stared after them. With a horrid regularity, the little man flung up his arms and screamed, "Look up there!" And presently they turned a corner and disappeared, and the screams grew fainter. For a moment, Mr. Packard stared upwards too, and then, as another flash speared down to the sea, He came to himself, and turning up the collar of his coat, started to run through the blinding rain back to the hotel. The Third Shadow by H.R. Wakefield. "And the other man on the rope, Andrew?" I asked. "Did you ever encounter him?" He gave me a quick glance and tapped the ash from his cigarette. "Well, is there such a one?" he asked, smiling. "I've many times read of him," I replied. "Didn't Smythe actually see him on the Brenva face and again on that last dread lap of Everest?" Sir Andrew paused before replying. No one, glancing casually at that eminent and superbly discreet civil servant, Sir Andrew Poursuivant, would have guessed that in his day and prime he had been the second-best amateur mountaineer of all time, with a dozen first ascents to his immortal fame, and many more than a dozen of the closest looks at death vouchsafed to any man. One who had leaped almost from the womb onto his first hill, a gravity defier by right of birth, soon to revolutionize the technique of rock climbing, and later to write two of the very finest books on his exquisite art. Yet there was something about that uncompromising buttress, his chin, the superbly modelled arête, his nose, those unflinching blue tarns, his eyes, and the high wide cliff of his brow to persuade the reader of faces that here was a born man of action, endowed with that strange and strangely named faculty, presence of mind, which ever finds in great emergency and peril the stimulus to a will and a cunning to meet and conquer them. We were seated in my stateroom in the Queen Elizabeth, bound for New York. He for some recurrent brawl, I on the interminable quest for dollars. The big tub was pitching hard into a nor'west blizzard and creaking her vast length. I am but an honorary member of the Corps of Mountaineers, having no head for the game. But I love it dearly by proxy, and as the sage tells us, he who thinks on Himalaya shall have pardon for all sins, and the same is true, I hope, of lesser ranges. I dined with Sir Andrew perhaps half a dozen times a year, and usually persuaded him on these felicitous occasions to tell me some great tale of the past. Hence, on this felicitous occasion, my fishing inquiry. "Yes, so I remember," he presently said. "But are there not nice and plausible explanations for that? The illusions consequent on great height, great strain? You may remember Smythe, who is highly psychic, saw something else from Everest, very strange wings beating the icy air." "He isn't the only one," I said. "It's a well-documented tradition." "It is. I agree. Guides, too, have known his presence, and always at moments of great stress and danger, and he has left them when these moments passed. And if they do not pass, the fanciful might suggest he meets them on the other side. But who he is, no one knows. I grant you also, I myself have sometimes felt that over, say, 12,000 feet, one moves into a realm where nothing is quite the same, or perhaps, and more likely, it is just one's mind that changes, and becomes more susceptible and exposed to, well, certain oddities." "But you have never encountered this particular oddity?" I insisted. "What an importunate bagman you are." "I believe you have, Andrew, and you must tell me of it." "That is not quite so," he replied. "But it will be 35 long years ago next June. I did once have a very terrible experience that had associated with it certain subsidiary experiences somewhat recalcitrant to explanation." "That is a very cautious pronouncement, Andrew. Phrased in the jargon of my trade, Bill. And you're going to relate it to me?" "I suppose so. I've never actually told it to another, and it will give me no pleasure to rouse it from my memory. But perhaps I owe it to you. Fill your glass, mind that lurch, and proceed." "I haven't told it before," said Sir Andrew. "Partly because it's distasteful to recall, and partly for the reason that the prudent sea captain turns his blind eye on a sea serpent and keeps a buttoned lip over the glimpse he caught. No one much appreciates the grin of incredulous derision. I promised to keep a straight face," I assured him. "Yes, I rather think you will. Well, all those years ago, in that remote and golden time, I knew and climbed with a man I will call Brown. He was about my age. He had inherited considerable position and fortune, and he was heir also to that irresistible and consuming passion for high places, their conquest and company which, given the least opportunity, will never be denied, and only decrepitude or death can frustrate. Technically, he was a master in all departments, a finished cragsman, and just as expert on snow and ice. But there was just occasionally an unmastered streak of recklessness in him which floored him as a leader, and everyone, including myself, preferred to have him lower down the rope. It was, perhaps, due to one of these reckless seizures, that after our 4th season together, he proposed to a wench who replied promptly in the affirmative. He was a smallish fellow, though immensely lithe, active, strong, and tough. She was not far short of 6 feet, and tipped the beam at 168 pounds, mostly muscle. With what suicidal folly, my dear Bill, do these infatuate pygmies, like certain miserable male insects, doom themselves with such Boadiceas, and how pitilessly and jocundly do those monsters bounce upon their prey! Oh, this particular specimen was terribly, viciously county, immensely handsome, and intolerably authoritarian. Speaking evil of the dead is often the only revenge permitted us, and I have no intention of refraining from saying that I have seldom, almost certainly never, disliked anyone more than Hecate Quorn. Besides being massive and menacing to the nth degree, she was endowed with a reverberating contralto which loaned a fearsomely oraculate air to her insistent spate of edicts. Marry for lust and repent in haste, the oldest, saddest lesson in the world, and one my poor friend had almost instantly to learn. Once she'd gripped him in her red, remorseless maw, she bullied him incessantly and appeared to dominate him beyond hope of release. Such an old story, I need enlarge upon it no more. How many of our old friends have we watched fall prostrate before these daughters of Masra? She demanded that he should at least attempt to teach her to climb, and females of her build are seldom much good at the game, particularly if they are late beginners. She was no exception, and her nerve turned out to be surprisingly more suspect on a steepish slope than her ghastly assurance on the level would have suggested. Poor Brown plugged away at it, because he feared, if she chucked her hand in, he would never see summer snow again. He did his very desperate best. He hired Fritz Mann, the huskiest and best-tempered of all the Chamonix guides, and between them, on one searing and memorable occasion, they shoved and pulled and hauled and slid her on feet and rump to creditably near the summit of Mont Blanc. She loathed the ordeal, but she refused to give in, just because she knew poor Brown was longing to join up with a good party and have some fun. I need say no more. You have sufficient imagination fully to realize the melancholy and humiliating pass of my sad friend. And of course it wasn't only in Haute-Savoie and Valais she made his life hell. It was at least purgatory for the rest of the year. She was eternal punishment, one might say. A harsh sentence for a moment's indiscretion. What about those occasional feckless flashes? I asked. Had she quenched and overlaid those too? Permit me to tell this story my own way, and pour me out another drink. In the second summer after their marriage, the Browns had preceded me by a few days to the Mountaineer, which, doubtless you recall, is a hotel overlooking the Mer de Glace, 3,000 feet above Chamonix. When I arrived there late one evening, I found the place in a turmoil, and Brown apparently almost out of his mind. Hecate had fallen down a crevasse that morning, and, as a matter of fact, her body was never recovered. I took him to my room, gave him a stiff drink, and he blurted out his sorry tale. He had taken her out on the Mer de Glace for a morning's training, he said, determined to take no risks whatsoever. They had wandered a little way up the glacier, perhaps further than he'd intended. He'd cut some steps for her to practice on, and so forth. Presently, he'd encountered a crevasse crossed by a snow bridge, which he'd tested and found perfectly reliable. He'd passed over himself, but when she followed, she'd gone straight through. The rope had snapped, and that was that. They'd lowered a guide, but the hole went down forever, and it was quite hopeless. Hecate must have died instantly. That was the only assuaging thought. "Should that rope have gone, Arthur?" I asked. "Can I see it?" He produced it. It was poor stuff, an Austrian make, which had once been very popular, but had been found unreliable and the cause of several accidents. There was also old bruising near the break. It wasn't a reassuring bit of stuff. "I realize," said Brown hurriedly. "I shouldn't have kept that piece. As you know, I'm a stickler for perfection in a rope, but we were just having a little easy work, and as that rope's light and she always found it so hard to manage one, I took it along. I had no intention of actually having to trust to it. We were just turning back when it happened. I swear to you that bridge seemed absolutely sound." "She was a good deal heavier than you, Arthur," I said. "I know, but I made every allowance for that." "I quite understand," I said. "Well, it's just too bad," or words to that effect. I was rather at a loss for appropriate expressions. He was obviously acting a part. I didn't blame him. He had to. He had to appear heavy with grief when he was feeling, in a sense, as light as mountaineer. He got a shade tight that evening, and his efforts to sustain two such conflicting moods would have amused a more cynical and detached observer than myself. Besides, I foresaw the troubles ahead. The French held an inquiry, of course, and inevitably exonerated him completely. Then I took him home to face the music, which, as I'd expected, was strident and loud enough. How far was it justified, I asked myself. He should, perhaps, not have taken Hecate up so far. Even if that rope hadn't gone, he'd never have been able to pull her up by himself. It would have taken two very strong men to have done that. He could merely have held her there, and she would, I suppose, have died of slow strangulation, unless help had quickly come. Yet, there is always a risk, however prudently you try to play that game. It is the first of its rules, and nothing will ever eliminate it. You must take my word for all this, which is rather outside your sphere of judgment. All the same, the condition of that rope, and I wasn't the only one to examine it, didn't help things. Still, all that wouldn't have mattered nearly so much if he'd been a happily married man. I needn't dwell on that. Anyway, the dirty rumour followed him home and resounded there. "What was your candid opinion, Andrew?" I asked. "I must ask you," he replied. "To believe, a rather hard thing, that I had and have no opinion, candid or otherwise. It could have been a pure accident. All could have happened exactly as he said it did. I've no valid reason to suppose otherwise. He may have been a bit careless. I might have been so myself. One takes such practice mornings rather lightly. There is risk, as I've said, but it's minuscule compared with the real thing. The expert mountaineer develops an exquisitely nice and certain feel for degrees of danger. It is the conditioned precept of his survival, and adjusts his whole personality to changing degrees. He must take the small ones in his stride. The errors of judgment, if any, that Brown committed were petty and excusable. His reason for taking that rope was sensible enough, in a way. Yes, I put in. I can more or less understand all that, but you actually knew him well, and you're a shrewd judge of character. You're in a privileged position to decide. Was I? A very learned judge once told me he'd find it far easier to decide the guilt or innocence of an absolute stranger than of a close friend. The personal equation confuses the problem and pollutes the understanding. I think he was perfectly right. Anyway, I am shrewd enough to know when I am baffled, and I have always felt the balance of probability was peculiarly nicely poised. In a word, I have no opinion. Well, I have, I proclaimed. I think he had a sudden, fearful temptation. I don't think it was exactly premeditated, yet always, as it were, at the back of his mind. He realized that bridge would go when she had her weight on it, knew a swift, reckless temptation, and let it rip. I think he'd kept that rotten rope because he'd always felt in a vague, half-repressed way it might, as they say, come in handy one day. Sir Andrew shrugged his shoulders. Very subtle, no doubt, he said, and you may be right, but I know I shall never be able to decide. Perhaps it's that personal equation, for I was always fond of him, and he saved my life more than once at the greatest peril to his own. And since his marriage, that ordeal of thumbscrew and rack, I had developed profound sympathy for him. Hecate was far better dead. I greeted his release with a saturnine cheer. We will leave that point. Well, he had to face a very bad time. Hecate's relatives were many and influential, and they pulled no punches, no stabs in the back, rather. No one, of course, actually cried murder in public, but such terms as darned odd, very happy release, accidents must happen, and so on, were in lively currency. Very few people comprehend the first thing about mountaineering, just sultry, celluloid visions of high-altitude and octane villains slashing ropes. So this sepsis found receptive bloodstreams. I did my best to foster antibodies and rallied my fellow climbers to the defense, but we were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, and it was lucky for poor Brown he had more than sufficient private means to retire from public life to his estate and his farming, and insulate himself to some extent against the slings and arrows which were so freely and cruelly flying about. I spent a weekend with him in April, and was shocked at his appearance. Even life with Hecate had never reduced him to such a pass. His nerves were forever on the jump. He had those glaring, insomniac eyes. He was drinking far more and eating far less than was good for him. He looked a driven, haunted man. Haunted? I asked. I know what you mean, he said, but I don't think I can be more definite. I will say, however, I found the atmosphere of the house unquiet, and was very glad to quit it. Anyway, something had to be done. You must start climbing again, Arthur, I said. Never. My nerve's gone, he replied. Nonsense, I said. We'll leave on June 3rd for Chamonix. You must conquer all this, and at the very place which tests you most starkly. You will be amongst friends. It will be a superb nerve tonic. This tittle-tattle will inevitably die down. It has started to do so already, I fancy. There is nothing to fear, as you'll discover once you're fit again. Come back to your first, your greatest, your only real love. What will people say? He muttered uncertainly. What say they let them say? Actually, I think it'll be very good propaganda. No one would believe a guilty man would return to the scene of such a crime. My dear Arthur, you're a bit young to die, aren't you? If you stay moping here, you'll be in the family vault in a couple of years. I'll get the tickets, and we'll dine together at the Alpine Club on June the 2nd, at 8 p.m. precisely. To this he promptly agreed, and his fickle spirits rose. So the 4th of June saw us entering the Montanvert, where our reception was cordial enough. It took him over a week, far longer than usual, to get back to anything like his old standard, but I'd expected that. On the 9th day, I decided it was time for a crucial test of his recovery. It was no use frittering about. He'd got to face the hard thing, something far tougher than the practice grounds. After some deliberation, I chose the Don de Chauny for the trial run. It was an old friend of ours, and the last time we'd done it, 4 years before, we'd simply raced to the aluminium Madonna, which more or less adorns its summit. The jaunt, I will remind you, is a needle some 13,000 feet high, situated towards the southern rim of that great and glorious lake of ice, part French, part Swiss, part Italian, from which rise some of the most renowned peaks in the world, and of those the acknowledged monarchs are the Grand Juras, the Grépon Aiguille, and, of course, the Mont Blanc Massif itself. It is sacred ground to our fraternity, and the very words ring like a silver peal. The jaunt culminates in a grotesque colossal tooth or rock, some of which is in a fairly advanced state of decay. These things are relative, of course. It will almost certainly be standing there, somewhat diminished in 5,000 years' time. It provides an interesting enough climb, not, in my view, one of the most severe, but sheer and exposed enough. Nowadays, I understand the livelier sections are so festooned with spikes and cords that it resembles the fruit of the union of a porcupine and a puppet. But I have not revisited it for years, and for very sure I never shall again. Brown agreed with my choice, which he declared himself competent to tackle. So off we went late on a promising morning, and made our leisurely way up and across the ice to the hat. He seemed in pretty good shape, and once, when a most towering and displeasing serac fell almost dead on our line, he kept his head, his footing, and his life. Yet somehow I didn't quite like the look of him. He didn't improve as the day wore on, and to tell the truth, I didn't either. Here Sir Andrew paused, lit a cigarette, and continued more slowly. You are not familiar with such matters, but I will try and explain the cause of my increasing preoccupation. We were, of course, roped almost all day, and from very early on I began to experience those intimations. It is difficult to find the precise, inevitable word, which were increasingly to disturb and perplex me on that tragic expedition. It is extremely hard to make them plain and plausible to you, who have never been hitched to a Manila. When merely pursuing a more or less untrammeled course over ice, it is our custom to keep the rope neither trailing nor quite taut. But always, I speak as leader, of course, one is very conscious of the presence and pressure of the man behind. Now, how shall I put it? Well, over and over again it seemed to me as if that rope was behaving oddly, as though the pull I experienced was inconsistent with the distance Brown was keeping behind me, as though something else was exercising pressure nearer to me. Do I make myself at all plain? I think so, I replied. You mean as though there was someone tied to that rope between you and Brown? Nothing like so definite and distinct as that. Imagine if you were driving a car, and you continually got the impression the brakes were coming on and off, though you knew they were not. You would be puzzled and somewhat disconcerted. I'm afraid that analogy isn't very illuminating. It was just that I was conscious of some inexplicable anomaly connected with our roped progress that day. I remember I kept glancing around in search of an explanation. I tried to convince myself it was due to Brown's somewhat inept, sluggish, and erratic performance, but I was not altogether successful in this attribution. To make it worse, a thick mist came on in the afternoon, and this increased our difficulties, delayed us considerably, and intensified my somber and rather defeatist mood. Certain pious, but in my view misguided persons, profess to find in the presence, the atmosphere of these doomed titans, evidence for a benevolent providence and a beneficent cosmic principle. I am not enrolled in their ranks. At best, these eminences seem aloof and neutral, at worst viciously and virulently hostile. I reverse the pathetic fallacy. That is, to a spirited man, half their appeal. Only once in a long while have I been lulled into a sense of their good will. And if one must endow them with a pantheon, I would people it with the fickle and malicious denizens of Olympus and Valhalla, and not the allegedly philanthropic triad of heaven. In no place is the working of a ruthless, blind causality more starkly shown, and never, for some reason, have I felt that oppressive sense of malignity more acutely than during the last few hours of our climb that day, as we forced our groping way through a nightmare world of ice pillars, many of them as high and ponderous as the Statue of Liberty, destined, each one of them, soon to fall with a thunder like the crack of doom. And all the while I was bothered with that rope. Several times, as I glanced round through the murk, I seemed to sense Brown almost at my heels when he was 30 feet away. Once I actually saw him, as I thought, near enough to touch. It was a displeasing illusion. "Were you scared?" I asked. I was certainly keyed up and troubled. I am never scared, I think, when actually on the move. It was just that there was a noxious puzzle I couldn't solve. We were in no great danger, just experiencing the endemic risks inherent in all such places. But I was mainly responsible for the safety of us both, and my mode of securing that safety was impaired. "I imagine," I said, "that the rope establishes, as it were, some psychic bond between those it links." "An unexpectedly precipient remark," replied Sir Andrew. "That is precisely the case. The rope makes the fate of one the fate of all, and each betrays along its strands his spiritual state, his hopes, anxieties, good cheer, or lack of confidence. So I could feel Brown's hesitation and poor craftsmanship, as well as this inexplicable interruption of my proper connection with him. When we eventually reached the hut, I had in no way elucidated the problem. I didn't like the look of Brown. He was far more tired than he should have been, and his nerves were sparking again. He put the best face he could on it, as good mountaineers are trained to do, and declared a night's rest would put him right. I hoped for the best. "Did you mention your trouble with the rope?" "I did not," said Sir Andrew shortly. "For one thing, it might have been purely subjective. For another, what was there to say? And the first duty of the mountaineer is to keep his fears to himself, unless they are liable to imperil his comrades. Never lower the psychic temperature, if it can possibly be avoided. Yet somehow, I cannot define precisely how, I gained the impression he had noticed something, and that this was partly the cause of his malaise. The hut was full, but not unpleasantly so, with young Italians for the most part, and we secured good sleeping places. Then we fed and lay down. It was a night of evil memory. Brown went to sleep almost at once, to sleep and to dream, and to tell of his dreams. He was, apparently, well beyond all doubt dreaming of Hecate and, how shall I put it, in contact, in debate with her. And what made it far more trying to the listener, he was mimicking her voice with perfect virtuosity. This was at once horrible and ludicrous, the most pestilential and disintegrating combination of all, in my opinion. He was, it seemed, pleading with her to leave him alone, to spare him, and she was ruthlessly refusing. I say it seemed, because the repulsive surge of words was blurred, and only at times articulate, just sufficient to give, as it were, the sense of the dialogue. But that was more than enough. The sleep-hungry Italians were naturally and vociferously infuriated, and I was compelled to rouse Brown over and over again, but each time he relapsed into that vilely haunted sleep. Once he raised himself and thrust out blindly with his arms, and Hecate's minatory contralto spewed from his throat, while the Italians mocked and cursed. It was a bestial pandemonium. The Italians left early, loud in their execrations of us. One of them, his black eyes wide with fear and anger, shook his lantern in my face and exclaimed, "Who is this woman?" "What woman?" I replied. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "That is for you to say. I do not think I would climb the jaunt with him if I were you. Good luck, senor. I think you will need it." Then they clattered off, and at 4 o'clock we followed them. I know now I should have taken that Italian's advice and got Brown back by the easiest and quickest route to the hotel. But when I tentatively suggested it, he almost hysterically implored me to carry on. "If I fail this time," he said, "I shall never climb again. I know it. I must conquer it." I was very tired. My judgment and resolution were at a disgracefully low ebb, and I half surrendered. I decided we would go up some of the way to a ledge or platform I remembered, at about the 12,000-foot level, rest, eat, and turn back. We had a tiresome climb up the glacier, Brown in very poor form, and that nuisance on the rope beginning again almost at once. We crossed the big crevasse where the glacier meets the lower rocks and began to ascend. There was still some mist, but it thinned as the sun rose. I led, and Brown, making very heavy weather, followed. The difference between his performance this time and that other I have mentioned was gross and terrifying. I remember doubting if he would ever be a climber again, and realizing I had made a shocking error in going on. I had to nurse him with the greatest care, and there was always that harassing behavior of the rope. Only those with expert knowledge of such work could realize the great and deadly difference it made. I could never be quite sure when I had it properly firm on Brown, and he was climbing like a nervous novice. My own standard of the day was, not surprisingly, none too high. I'd had a damned bad, worried night, and my mind was fussed and preoccupied. Usually one climbs half subconsciously. That is the sign manual of the expert, a rhythmic selection and seizure of holds, with only now and again a fully controlled operation of will and decision. But now I was at full stretch all the time, and ever ready for Brown to slip. Over and over again I was forced to belay the rope to some coign of vantage and coax and ease him up, and there was forever that strong interruption between us. The jaunt was beating us hands down all the time, and I hadn't felt so outclassed since my first season in the Alps. The light became most sinister and garish, the sun striking through the brume, creating a potent and prismed dazzle. So much so that more than once I fancied I saw Brown's outline duplicated, or rather revealed at different levels. And several times it seemed his head appeared just below me when he was still struggling far down. And then there were our shadows, cast huge on the snow face across the gulf, vast and distorted by those strange rays. That there were 3 such shadows, now stationary, now in motion, was an irresistible illusion. There was mine, there was the lesser one of Brown, and there was another in between us. What was causing it? This fascinating and extraordinary puzzle served somewhat to distract my mind from its heavy and intensifying anxiety. At last, to my vast relief, I glanced up and saw that hospitable little platform not more than 60 feet above me. Once there, the worst would be, I thought, over, for I could lower Brown down more easily than get him up. I shouted down to him, "We're nearly there," but he made no reply. I shouted again and listened carefully, and then I could hear him talking, using alternatively his voice and Hecate's. I cannot describe to you the kind of ghostly fear which then seized me. There I was, 1,500 feet up on a pretty sheer precipice, with someone whose mind had clearly gone on my rope, and I had to get him first to the ledge, then try and restore him to a condition in which descent might be possible. I could never leave him there. We must survive or die together. First, I must reach that platform. I set myself to it, and for the time being he continued to climb, clumsily and mechanically, and carrying on that insane dialogue, yet he kept moving. But for how much longer would that mechanism continue to function and bring him to his holds? I conquered my fear and rallied again that essential detachment of spirit, without which we were both certainly doomed. So I set myself with the utmost care to reach that ledge. Between me and it was a stretch of the Jaunt's rottenest rock, which I suddenly remembered well. It is spiked and roped now, I believe. When that gneiss is bad, it is very, very evil indeed. Mercifully, the mist was not freezing, or we should have been dead here then. How I cursed my insensate folly, the one great criminal blunder of my climbing career. This rush of rage may have saved me, for just when I was struggling up that infamous 45 feet, I got a fearful jerk from the rope. I was right out, attacking a short overhang, exposed 100%, and how I sustained that jerk I shall never know. I even drove my teeth into the rock. It was one of those superhuman efforts only possible to a powerful, fully trained man at the peak of his physical perfection, when he knows that failure means immediate death. Somehow, then, he draws out his final urge of strength and resilience. At last I reached the ledge, belayed like lightning, gasped for breath, and looked down. As I did so, Brown ceased to climb, screamed, and then a torrent of wild, incoherent words spewed from his mouth. I yelled at him encouragement and assurance, but he paid no heed. And, though he was stationary, clawing to his holds, the rope was still under pressure, working and sounding on the belay. No explanation of that has ever been vouchsafed me. For a moment, my glance flickered out across the great gulf onto the dazzling slope opposite, and there were my shadows and Brown's, and another, which seemed still on the move and reaching down towards him. I could see his body trembling in every muscle, and I knew he must go at any second. I shouted down wildly again and again, telling him I had him firm and that he could take his time, but again he paid no heed. I couldn't get him up. I must go down to him. There was just one possible way which, a shade technical, I will not describe to you. Nor is there need or point in doing so, for suddenly Brown relinquished all holds and swung out. As my eye followed him, once more it caught those shadows, and now there were but two, Brown's hideously enlarged. For a moment he hung there, screaming and thrashing out with his arms, his whole body in violent motion, and then he began to spin most horribly, faster and faster, and almost it seemed in the visual chaos of that whirl as though there were two bodies lashed and struggling in each other's arms. Then somehow, in his writhings, he worked free of the rope and fell 2,000 feet to his death on the glacier below, leaving my shadow alone, gigantic, on the snow. That is all, and I want no questions, because I know I should have no answers for them, and I am off to bed. As for your original question, I've done my best to answer it. But remember this, perchance such questions can never quite be answered. The Frontier Guards by H.R. Wakefield. "What a charming little house," said Brinton, as he was walking in from a round of golf at Ellsborough with Lander. "Yes, from the outside," replied Lander. "What's the matter with the inside? Eozoic plumbing?" "No, the usual offices are neat, if not gaudy. Spengler would probably describe them as contemporary with the death of Lincoln, but it's not that. It's haunted." "It is, by Jove," said Brinton, gazing up at it. "Fancy such a dear little Queen Anne piece having such a nasty reputation. I see it's unoccupied." "It usually is," replied Lander. "Tell me about it." "During dinner I will, but you seem to find something of interest about those windows on the second floor." Brinton gazed up for a moment or two longer, and then started to walk back in silence beside his host. In a few minutes they reached Lander's cottage. It was rather more pretentious than that, an engaging two-storied structure added to and modernized from time to time, formerly known as the Old Vicarage, and rechristened Lamers. Black and white and creeper-lined, with a trim little garden of rose-trees and mellow turf, 2 fine limes, and a great yew impenetrable and secret. This little garden melted into an arable expanse, and there was a lovely view over to some high Chiltern spurs. The whole place just suited Lander, who was, or it might be more accurate to say, wanted to be, a novelist, a commonplace and ill-advised ambition, but he had money of his own and could afford to wait. James Brinton, his guest for a week, and a very old friend, occupied himself with a picture gallery in Mayfair. A very small gallery, one rather small room to be exact, but he had admirable taste and made it pay. 2 hours later they sat down to dinner. "Now then," said Brinton, as Mrs. Dunkley brought in the soup, "tell me about that house." "Well," replied Lander, "I've had, as you know, much more experience of such places than most people, and I consider Pailton the worst or the best specimen I have heard or read of or experienced. For one thing, it is a killer. The majority of haunted houses are harmless. The peculiar energy they have absorbed and radiate forth is not hostile to life, but in others the radiation is malignant and fatal. Pailton has been rented 5 times in the last 12 years. In each case the tenancy has been marked by a violent death within its walls. For my part, I have no 2 opinions concerning the morality of letting it at all. It should be razed to the ground. How long do its occupants stick it out, as a rule? 6 weeks is the record, and that was made by some people called Pendexter. That was 3 years ago. I knew Pendexter père, and he was a courageous and determined person. His daughter was hurled down the stairs one night and killed, and I shall never forget the mingled fury and grief with which he told me about it. Previous to that, he had detected 18 different examples of psychic action, appearances and sounds, several definitely malignant. The family had not enjoyed one single day of freedom from abnormal phenomena. "How long since it was last occupied?" asked Brinton. "It has been empty for a year, and I am inclined to think it will remain so. Anyone who comes down to look at it is given a pretty straight tip by one or other of us to keep away." "Does it affect you violently?" "I have never set foot in it." "What? You of all people?" "My dear Jim, just for that very reason. When I first discovered I was psychic, I felt flattered and anxious to experience all I could. I soon changed my mind. I found I experienced quite enough without any need for making opportunities. I do to this day. Several times I have had a visitor in the study here after dinner, an uninvited guest, and it has always been so. I have many times heard and seen things which could not be explained in places with perfectly clean bills of psychic health, and one never gets quite used to it. Terror may pass, but Some distress of mind is invariable. Any person gifted or afflicted like myself will tell you the same. It seems to me sometimes as if I actually assist in evoking and materializing these appearances, that I help to establish a connection between them and the place I inhabit, that I am a most unpleasant kind of lightning conductor. Is there any possible explanation for that? Well, I have formed one, but it would take rather a long time to explain, and may be quite fallacious. Anyhow, there has never been any need for me to visit such places as Pailton, and I keep away from them if I can. Would you very much object to going in for a minute or two? Why? Well, I have been bothered all my life about this business of ghosts. I have never seen one. In a sense, I don't believe in them. Yet I am convinced you have known many. It is a maddening dualism of mind. I feel if I could just once come in contact with something of the kind, I should feel a sense of enormous relief. And you'd like me to conduct you over Pailton? Not if it would really upset you. It would be at your own risk, said Lander, smiling. I'll risk it. You mustn't imagine that you can go into a disturbed spot such as this and expect to see about 10 ghosts in as many minutes. Even in the case of such a busy hive as Pailton, there are many quiet periods, and some people simply cannot see ghosts. The odds are very much against your desire being granted. Though, if you are psychic, the atmosphere of the place would affect you at once. How? Well, you've often heard of people who know by some obscure but infallible instinct that there's a cat in the room. Just so. However, I'll certainly give you the chance. It won't seriously disturb me. I can get the key in the morning from the woman who looks after it, though I need hardly say she doesn't sleep there. There is no need for a caretaker. It was broken into once, but the burglar was found dead in the dining room, and since then the crooks have given it a wide berth. It really is dangerous, then. Beginning to feel a bit prudent? No, I shall feel safe with you. Very well, then. After coming back from golf, we'll pay it a visit. It will be dark by 5, and we'll make the excursion about 6. The chances of gratifying your curiosity will be better after dark. I'd better tell you something else. I never quite know how these places are going to affect me. Before now, I have gone off into a kind of trance and been decidedly weird, my dear Jim. My sense of time and space becomes distorted, though for your assurance I may say, he added, smiling, I am never dangerous when in this condition. Furthermore, you must be prepared to make acquaintance with a mode of existence in which the ordinary laws of existence which you have always known abdicate themselves. Bierce called his famous book of ghost stories, Can These Things Be? Assuredly they can. Now I'm sounding pompous and pontifical, but some such warning is necessary. When I touch that front door tomorrow, I may become in a sense a stranger to you. Once inside, we shall cross a frontier into a region with its own laws of time and space, and where the seemingly impossible can happen. Do you understand what I mean, and still want to go? Yes, replied Brinton, to all your questions. Very well, then, said Lander. I will now get out the chessmen and discover a complete answer to Retty's opening which you sprang on me last night. So you shall have the white pieces. November 21st was a lazy, drowsy, cloudless day, starting with a sharp ground frost which, thawing unresistingly as the sun climbed, made the tees at Elsborough like tiny slides. In consequence, neither Brinton nor Lander played very good golf. This upset Brinton not at all, for he was thinking much more of that which was beginning to impress him as a possible ordeal, the crossing of the threshold of Pailton, a few hours later. As they finished their second round, a mist, spreading like a gigantic spider's web, was beginning to raise the level of the Buckinghamshire fields. As they walked homewards, it climbed with them, keeping pace with them like a dog, sometimes hurrying ahead, then dropping back, but always with them. It was exactly 5 o'clock as they reached Lamer's. Tea was ready. "Do you still want to go, Jim?" asked Lander abruptly. "Sure, Bo," replied Brinton lightly. "Here's the key," said Lander, smiling. "The open sesame to the Chamber of Horrors. The electric light is turned off, so all the light we shall have will be produced by my torch. One last word of advice. If you want to get the best chance of a thrill, try to keep your mind quite empty. Don't talk as I personally conduct this tour. Concentrate on not concentrating." "I understand what you mean," said Brinton. "Well then, let's get a move on," said Lander. An idea suddenly occurred to Brinton. "How will you be able to show me over it if you've never been inside it?" "You needn't worry about that," replied Lander. The fog was thick by now, and they wavered slightly as they groped their way down the lane, compressed by high hedges, which led to Paleton. When they reached it, Brinton's eyes turned up to observe the windows on the second floor, and then Lander stepped forward and placed the key in the lock. As the door swung open, the fog, which seemed to have been crouching at his heels, leapt forward and entered with him and inundated the passage down which he moved. The moment he was inside, something advanced to meet him. He opened a door on the left of the passage and flashed his torch round it. The fog was in there, too. Jim, he could feel, was at his elbow. "This is where they found the burglar. It's the dining room." His voice was not quite under control. "Quite a pleasant room. Smells a bit frosty." The little beam wandered from chair to desk, settling for a moment here and there. Then he shut the door and stepped along the passage till the little beam revealed a flight of stairs, which he began to climb. He still heard Brinton's steps coming up behind him. Up on the first floor, he opened another door. "This is the drawing room," he said. "The proctor's cook was found dead here in 1921. Round swung the tiny beam, fastening on chairs, tables, desks, curtains. He shut the door and began to climb another flight of stairs. He could hear Jim's feet pattering up behind him. On the second floor, he opened still another door. "This, my dear Jim, is the nasty one. It was from here Amy Pendexter fell and broke her neck." His voice had risen slightly, and he was speaking quickly. Once again he flashed his torch over chairs, tables, curtains, and a head. "Well, Jim, do you get any reaction? Do you? You can speak now." As there was no answer, he turned and swung the beam of his torch onto the person just behind him. But it wasn't Brinton who was standing at his elbow. "What's the matter, Willie?" asked Brinton. "Can't you find the keyhole?" The figure in front of him remained motionless. "Can't you find the keyhole?" asked Brinton more urgently. As the figure still remained motionless, Jim Brinton lit a match and peered forward, and then he reeled back. "Who in God's name are you?" he cried. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,